cohort working together. So why this book? So I was a graduate student at the U in modern Russian and modern European history, and then I taught those subjects for about 20 years on a college level. And in the world of modern European and modern Russian history, no one ever doubts for a moment the significance of World War I. Massive carnage, 10 million combat deaths, plus millions of civilians died, a generation of traumatized veterans, many disabled and horribly disfigured, the collapse of 4 empires, Russian, Habsburg, German, and Ottoman, the complete redrawing of the map of Europe and the Near East, for better or for worse, the weakening of even the countries that won the war, so-called won the war, Britain, France, Italy. Mass killing was industrialized and, in a sense, normalized. And then, of course, all that set the stage for fascism. So no one in studies European history ever says, oh, is World War I important? No, it's not a problem. But when I started exploring Minnesota history, I was surprised that in the general surveys of Minnesota history that I looked at, World War I was kind of passed over as no big deal. And I said to myself, that can't be right. That can't be right. Early on, I read a book about the national home front in World War I, written by David Kennedy, who's a major historian. You may have seen his book about the Depression, which is kind of a standard book on the Depression. His book on the home front and during World War I is called Over Here, which I thought was a really clever title, actually. But anyway, there I read, Americans went to war in 1917 not only against Germans in the field of France, but against each other at home. What happened on the home front, he said, was a deadly serious contest to determine the consequences of the crisis for the character of American economic, social, and political life. Now that sounded right, right? So what was he thinking about? Well, what he had in mind was that in 1914, when the World War I broke out in Europe, lots of things were going on in the United States. There was this jarring transition to industrial capitalism dominated by large corporations and trusts. There was this mass migration from Europe and a nativist backlash against it. There was astounding economic inequality, which had begun in the Gilded Age. There was the rise of militant trade unionism, including the Industrial Workers of the World. There was populist farm organizing. There was the rise of the Socialist Party, led by Eugene Debs. There was the Great Migration of African Americans from south to north. There was the rise of the NAACP and other organizations to fight Jim Crow, discrimination, and lynching. There was the final push of the women's suffrage movement for voting rights. And on top of all that, the nation was in the grips of this wet versus dry debate, the movement for prohibition of alcohol production and sale. So would you expect all those changes and all those conflicts to just stop dead in their tracks because World War I broke out in Europe? No, they didn't stop in their tracks. They continued. So how did all this play out in Minnesota? It turned out that Minnesota was one of the hot spots of the war at home, the struggle for the home front. Not only because of all those conflicts, which were all brewing here in Minnesota, but also because there was great disagreement about whether the U.S. should enter the war, which it finally did in April of 1917 by declaring war on Germany. The overriding fact was that Minnesota was a deeply polarized place in this period. It's the most important fact about the whole thing. That's what this book is about. It's about the battles that raged in Minnesota during the war, when the state was governed when the state government was for a short time one of the most repressive in the nation, possibly the most repressive. It's hard to say. So I'm interested in how that impacted the state on a whole, but I'm also interested in how that experience of the World War I home front impacted individuals. I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. So how did this happen? Minnesota was one of these hot spots, this major hot spot. Well, first off, you have to keep in mind that the business leaders in the Twin Cities, led by the grain millers, the big banks, the manufacturers, were highly unified and highly organized. They tended to have a common heritage, that is to say they were all what you'd call Yankees, that is to say men of English or Scottish origin, who worshiped in the same churches, same Protestant churches. They lunched at the Minneapolis Club, They golfed at the Minnetonka Club. They formed organizations which were committed to keeping unions out of the state, fighting for what they called the open shop. And they were very effective and very successful. So in March of 1917, when the U.S. was just on the verge of entering the war, they acted quickly because they knew something had to be done to protect themselves. The legislature was about to adjourn until 1919. We had a biennial legislature then. They knew that the Minnesota National Guard, which was kind of their last line of defense during strikes, would certainly be federalized and sent to France once the U.S. entered the war. So they went to the legislature, and in about 2 weeks, they got this major piece of legislation passed to set up what was called the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety. Slide. Hey, there it is. Thank you. And this agency had the power, essentially, to govern the state for the duration of the war. And it had enormous powers to do that, pretty much unrestrained powers. It was an unelected body. It was composed of the governor, actually he was elected, and the attorney general also elected, but the governor then appointed 5 more members of the commission who were generally conservative businessmen. And one of them, slide, was John McGee. There he is. He was a lawyer, former judge. He had been a district court judge in Hennepin County and then went back to private practice because he wasn't making as much money as a judge as he wanted to. And he was basically what you could call a corporate lawyer representing railroads, banks, etc. Extreme conservative, extreme nationalist, hated unions, the Socialist Party, the IWW, and the Nonpartisan League. And so he became the de facto leader of the commission. The legislators set up the commission so that there were 7 members of the commission. The governor was on it, but the commission could only act by majority vote. It was a very interesting thing. They didn't really trust the governor because the governor had previously been a progressive, but now he wasn't so much a progressive. But anyway, so they set up this thing where it was 7 people who could vote, but John McGee, his powerful personality, essentially took over and ran the show. Now, there's a lot in the book about John McGee, but just to give you a slight little taste of what John McGee was like. In 1918, he was invited to Washington to testify in the U.S. Senate, in the Senate committee, where there was a bill being heard to take all cases involving sedition out of the courts and try them before military courts. It's like a big step towards martial law. And McGee was all for this. So he testified not just in favor of the bill, but he went so far as to say, where we made a mistake was in not establishing a firing squad in the first days of the war. We should now get busy and have that firing squad working overtime. These men who are fighting against our soldiers this side of the water and stabbing them in the back are going to die. All socialists should be in internment camps. This is now, he said even more extreme things privately, but this was his public testimony in the Senate. So this gives you an idea of what John McGee was like. So, the business leaders also, I should say, were particularly nervous in April 1917 because 3 things had just happened in 1916 that scared them. The first was a general rise in labor militancy in the cities, but also up north. So there was a wildcat strike in the iron mines that the IWW went up and started leading. And when that strike fizzled out, there was a second strike right after that among the lumberjacks that the IWW was also involved in leading. So that scared them. Labor militancy was really on the rise, and the IWW scared them in particular. The second thing was the election, slide please, of a socialist to be mayor of Minneapolis, Tom Van Leer. And so, for the business community meeting at the Minneapolis Club, the fact that a socialist had been elected mayor on their home turf was really disgusting. McGee said it made him sick. And he didn't have much power. It was kind of a weak mayor system. But one thing that the mayor did have power over was the police department. And so the business community didn't like this because although the Minnesota National Guard may have been their last line of defense, they wanted to have control of the police in strike situations. And now, God forbid, a socialist was in charge of the police department. So that made them very unhappy. The third thing was, and this was the big thing really, the victory of the Nonpartisan League in North Dakota in the November 1916 elections. where the Nonpartisan League, which was this new organization of farmers who had organized to seek political power to improve their bargaining position with the grain millers back in Minneapolis by getting state-run grain mills, crop insurance, eventually a state bank, which of course still exists, you may know. And so after the Nonpartisan League swept a victory in November 1916 in North Dakota, they moved their national office to St. Paul and made very clear that they wanted to replicate that victory in Minnesota in the following year. So these three things were in the mind of the business community when they set up the Commission for Public Safety. So the state was set up for conflict, and John McGee made sure that the Commission for Public Safety had its weapons in hand. A number of things. First off, the Home Guard. I think I have a slide for that. No, I don't. Sorry. Anyway, we'll come back to that slide in a second. So the Home Guard was essentially, eventually had 21 battalions around the state. It was essentially a businessman's militia. So they tried to get business people from the towns and the cities, professional men, business owners, etc., to kind of come out and train and sort of become a National Guard to take the role of National Guard, which is now going on to France, essentially for strike duty and to impose loyalty on the population during the period of war. Secondly, there was something called the Motor Corps, which was basically another wing of the Home Guard. So back then, remember now this is 1917, not everybody owned a car, but certainly middle class people did, and people in the business community. So the idea was to attract all these men to bring their cars, volunteers to bring their cars, form these Motor Corps battalions that would serve as kind of the mobile wing of the Home Guard in terms of strike action or whatever. Thirdly, the Commission had its own police force. It's 700 police that it could deputize. Most of the state's sheriffs were on board with the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety. Not all of them, but most of them were. There was 86 counties at the time, and maybe at least 70 of those sheriffs were really on board to do whatever the Commission for Public Safety needed. There were many patriotic organizations who sided with them. The Stars and Stripes League, the America First Association, Labor's Loyalty League, the National Security League, and it goes on and on and on. There's all these patriotic organizations. And finally, here's the slide. There was this incredible thing, probably the single most bizarre part of the whole story of the home front, the American Protective League. So in 1916, a guy got this bright idea. This is before the FBI existed, to form this organization of volunteer amateur detectives and offer their services to the U.S. government, to the federal government, to kind of expand the workforce of the federal investigative bodies. And eventually, this American Protective League claimed it had 250,000 amateur sleuths out there, opening your mail, spying on your neighbors, et cetera, et cetera. And the most bizarre part about this, because there was all these vigilante organizations out there, but the most bizarre part was that the Department of Justice said, oh, that's great, and accepted them, and sanctioned them, and even gave them these foolish badges to wear, as if they were somehow officially cops, which they weren't. They were just amateur vigilante detectives going around causing trouble, and they're a big part of the story. So the business community in Minneapolis, of course, saw this happening and eventually organized their own branch of the American Protective League, and it got an office in the federal court building, to run a show, even though it had nothing to do. I mean, it tells you a lot about this whole time to know about that. Anyway, so the book is about lots of conflict. We can't go into any of it in any detail, but I just want to mention two kind of high points. So there was two big kind of crucial crises during the war at home that were really telling. The first was a strike against the Twin Cities Rapid Transit Company, which was the monopoly that controlled all the streetcars in the whole Twin Cities area. Slide, I think. There we go. There's a streetcar transit strike. So this is a really long and complex story. So I'll just say it was a militant and violent strike that peaked with, believe it or not, a short-lived, 3.5-hour general strike in St. Paul. And when the general strike happened, the federal mediators came in and said they would mediate the strike, and the labor movement decided to accept that, which was a mistake because the transit company had no intention of paying any attention to what the federal mediators said. But anyway, the strike came to an end. So the strike failed, but it was very significant because the trade union people in the Twin Cities and the whole trade union movement, even the more conservative parts of it, kind of united around the carmen in supporting them. But they found out that they only had really one ally in the state, and that were the farmers of the Nonpartisan League who came to support the trade unionists. And also that they both had the same enemy, which was the Minnesota Commission on Public Safety. Because the Minnesota Commission on Public Safety did everything it could to help the transit company break the strike. So this was the beginnings of a class alliance that laid the groundwork for what would become, in a couple years, the Farmer Labor Party. So it was kind of a failed strike with important repercussions. And you know, I think I have another slide there. Maybe, do I? Yeah, there it is. So this is the Home Guard in action. So one of the things the Home Guard, obviously did was strike work, and so the strike got kind of out of hand. I mean, where some people were breaking windows in streetcars, etc. So the governor mobilized Home Guard units from all around the state, and they came into town and patrolled the streets of St. Paul. It was December, so it was kind of cold, but you see they're well armed with clubs and pistols. So these are like businessmen from maybe Owatonna or something who came in to help stop the strike. Okay. The second big event was the June 1918 Republican primary. So the Nonpartisan League got its name from the strategy it used, which was to run its candidates in the open primaries of one or the other of the major parties. That's why it was called. That's why I called itself the Nonpartisan League, just because it was just a strategy. And so both parties had open primaries, so you could run in the Republican primary, for example, with your own candidates and possibly win. This is what happened in North Dakota. They essentially took over the Republican Party in North Dakota. So in Minnesota, in June of 1918, there was a primary, Republican primary, and the Nonpartisan League decided to go after the sitting governor, Governor Burnquist, who was on the Commission for Public Safety, and they nominated Charles Lindbergh Sr. Here we go, slide. Charles Lindbergh Sr., and notice I say senior because this is an area that's ripe for confusion. We're not talking about Charles Lindbergh Jr., we're talking about Charles Lindbergh Sr. So Charles Lindbergh Sr. Was from Little Falls, and he represented the 6th District in Congress from 1907 to 1917. He had not run in 1916 because he just wasn't getting anywhere in Congress, and then he became the candidate for the Nonpartisan League for governor in 1918. He was one of the most radical populists in Congress. He was very much aligned with, say, Robert La Follette in the Senate. He made a name for himself for taking on what was called the Money Trust, which was basically Wall Street, and trying to democratize the banking system. And basically fighting economic inequality was what he did his whole life. Everything that he did was around that issue. So he was a good candidate for the Nonpartisan League because he was respected both by the trade unions and by the farmers. But he was also very clearly on record as being opposed to the U.S. entry into the war. So when he was in Congress, he voted against it various times when it came up. And so the Burnquist and the Commission for Public Safety basically made loyalty the main issue of the campaign. In fact, Burnquist said, I'm not campaigning on anything else, I'm not going to talk about any issue. The only issue is loyalty. That is to say, you have to vote for me to save Minnesota from electing this pro-German Bolshevik, namely Charles Lindbergh. And that's what it was all about. So that was the way the campaign was played out on an ideological level, but what was really happening was that what was happening in addition was that there was a huge amount of violence and a huge amount of repression all throughout the state. So there was at least 20 counties where it was impossible for the Nonpartisan League to campaign at all. And where they did campaign, there was often violence, incredible hostility between townspeople against the local farmers who were aligned with the Nonpartisan League. So the Nonpartisan League caravan comes into town, townspeople pull off their signs and start fights. Happen all the time, constantly during May and June as the election was winding down. That's a huge story, and there's a lot more to say about that, which is in the book, but in any case, Burnquist won. Lindbergh actually carried 30 rural counties, and about 43% of the vote. And the Nonpartisan League thought they had done pretty well considering what they were up against, but that's the way it worked out. But again, this was another kind of stepping stone because Lindbergh did well in certain counties where the farmers are strong. He also did well in working class precincts in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And you could again sort of see this electoral coalition that led to the Farmer Labor Party coming into focus, which it did not too long after that. So besides telling this kind of big story about what happened, I'm also very interested, and I mentioned, in terms of how these big years of turmoil and social change impact the lives of individuals. And this is something really we all have in common. You know, Marx said, it's Karl Marx, not Groucho Marx, it's Karl Marx. We make our own history, but not just as we please. In other words, we all are plopped down into some historical context, economic, social, political, economic context. We may be Elon Musk, we may be a poor person, and whatever our context is really going to determine what we can do and limit in some way. Obviously, you can transcend things. There's free will, but your context in which you are plopped down has a big impact on how things are going. So I'm really interested in how this turmoil of the war at home affected individuals, and so I follow a certain number of individuals through the whole book, and that's really kind of one of the fun parts for me. The two big stars of the book, so to speak, are John McGee and Charles Lindbergh. And that was kind of obvious. John McGee, I thought, should be a big focus of the book because, first of all, I mean, he was kind of an amazing piece of work, but also he was the most powerful man in Minnesota for the duration of the war. And I think everybody should know him. I mean, he's very powerful. He's more powerful than actually governors were, because there was really nothing that stopped his power. So that's one kind of star of the show. The other star of the show is Lindbergh. And I have just, through this whole process, just been amazed at Charles Lindbergh and really how relevant Charles Lindbergh Sr. and how relevant he is for the present time, especially because his whole focus was basically fighting the gross economic inequality of the time. And so I mean, it's just, he like really worked hard on banking. I mean, it was kind of, most people wouldn't be interested in, but he thought, as someone who was from a rural area and he watched what was happening with banking in the rural area and what was happening to farmers with banking, he wanted to democratize the banking system, the credit system, and was one, so he just was working on this all the time. A really good example. But his memory, although he was really well known at the time, as one of the major figures in Minnesota politics, his memory has kind of been eclipsed by the memory of his son, who got in a plane, flew across the ocean to Paris, and became an international celebrity, and had the same name. So this is I'm trying to resurrect basically the profile of Charles Lindbergh Sr. because he's such an important figure that should be known about much more than he is, and he's very different than his son. So it's Charles A. Lindbergh Sr. Keep that in mind. I want to just mention the slide. Next slide. There's a bunch of other individuals. I'm going to just introduce you to a few of these characters to give you a sense of the breadth of the book. So among the characters that I follow are Albert Thander, who was he was from New Ulm. New Ulm was really a flashpoint in this whole story. He was the city attorney in New Ulm. He was a National Guard officer. And in July of 1917, there was a rally in New Ulm that he was a speaker at, where the people in New Ulm raised questions about the draft. Not that they were opposed to the draft, but they were asking that maybe, wouldn't it be okay if people of German ancestry not be drafted and sent to fight against Germans, namely their relatives. And for that, he got into big trouble, and anyway, he got, the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety used its power to depose him, and he had a lot of other problems too. Jens Grandal was a sort of prototypical local newspaper editor. He was from Red Wing. He started off a big fan of neutrality, and then became a rabid supporter of the Commission for Public Safety and kind of this militant nationalism. Very interesting. So this whole thing about the press during this time is really, really interesting. There was almost 750 newspapers in Minnesota in 1917. And so watching what was happening with those through Jens Grandal is very interesting. Maria Sanford, you may know, she was kind of a legendary University of Minnesota professor. And she's in the book kind of as an example of the many progressives who at first were opposed to the war, opposed to militarism, but once war broke out, decided to kind of go with it. And so she became a big cheerleader for the war. It's kind of an interesting transformation. Alice Ames Winter was a wealthy woman who was kind of the leader of the Women's Club movement nationally and in Minnesota. And she became the head of the Women's Auxiliary of the Minnesota Commission on Public Safety. You know, in those days, all the fraternal organizations, they always had to have a women's auxiliary. And so the Commission for Public Safety had one too. And she ran it out of her, basically out of her home on Lake of the Isles. Clarence Wigington, you may also know, I know you guys know, is a famous African-American architect from St. Paul. But he played an interesting role during World War I. So the Minnesota National Guard was completely segregated. There was no African-American units or African-Americans in the Minnesota National Guard. And when they set up the Home Guard, it was the same way. And so Wigington and some other folks from St. Paul petitioned the governor to set up an African-American unit of the Home Guard, the 16th Battalion. And he was the captain of one of the units. That's why he was often called Cap Wigington. And it was part of this whole struggle in the African-American community to kind of wedge open the door to desegregate the military a little bit. And that's what happened. That's another interesting story. And finally, Sarah Carlton Colvin was the Minnesota leader of the the National Women's Party, which was like the militant wing of the suffrage movement. And she, for example, ended up getting arrested several times at the White House when they were putting the pressure on Wilson. If we're going to Europe to fight the war for democracy, why can't we have democracy at home, like passing the suffrage amendment already? So this is what they were up to. So that's what would be going on there. So I think that's about it. Oh yeah, I want to say one more thing about that. My favorite part of the book is called the epilogue, and the subtitle is Lives After Wartime. And in the epilogue, Lives After Wartime, I trace what happened to all of these folks, especially McGee and Lindbergh, and these folks and other characters after the war. And I'm not going to say any more about that, but you'll find some really interesting surprises there about what happened to some of these people, for good or bad. Okay, so now.
It's about 7:40.
7:40. So I'm going to.
Stop talking.
Is that what that meant?
No, I just know he has 3 pieces to read.
No, I'm only.
Going to or not.
Yeah. So I wanted to read I'll only read 2, or maybe 1. No, so just to give you a little flavor of 2 things. One about how the book sounds, and also about what it was like to live in this period. So the first one is, like I said, the Nonpartisan League faced all this problems trying to campaign out in the counties. And one of the things that was going on is that certain county attorneys kept charging them with crimes, eventually with sedition, etc. And so they were constantly in court trying. And this is a story early in the process of kind of the first attempt to charge Nonpartisan League leaders with a crime. And it also involves a lawyer named James Manahan, who is, some of you may may catch this allusion. He was kind of the Ken Tilson of his time. He was like devoted his life to representing farmers and workers and basically fighting economic inequality, et cetera. And so, and he became a major lawyer for the Nonpartisan League. Okay, so here it goes. The first attempt by a county attorney to prosecute a Nonpartisan League speaker was a clumsy one, more of a farce than a crime drama, although it could have easily degenerated into a lynching. When Jackson County officials got wind of a Nonpartisan League meeting scheduled for January 23rd in Lakefield, E.H. Nicholas, the county attorney, wrote a letter to the Nonpartisan League promising to, quote, use every measure at our disposal to prevent you from speaking here and to prevent your organization from holding any future meetings in this county. This was happening all over the place. So Joe Gilbert, who was kind of the main organizer for the Nonpartisan League in Minnesota, decided that he would personally challenge this ban and see what would happen. So he went out to Lakeville, and he was standing on a wagon in town speaking to a group of farmers. And when he said, among other things, that some county officials spell patriotism starting with the letters P-A-Y, the sheriff arrested him for riot. Several farmers made his bail, and he agreed to return for trial on February 11th. So when he came back with James Manahan and H.A. Paddock, another Nonpartisan League attorney. They came to defend him for trial. The original charge of riot had been changed to unlawful assembly. Looking back years later, Manahan felt he underestimated how deeply small-town business owners and professionals hated the Nonpartisan League. He thought he had made the prosecutor's case look ridiculous. The pro-Nonpartisan League farmers in the courtroom were gleeful. However, after most of the farmers had gone home to milk their cows, the judge called an evening session. During an extended dinner break, the prosecution had found new witnesses. Near midnight, Manahan moved for an adjournment till the morning. The judge refused, but he did allow a man in the audience to auction a parrot. The parrot was named Kaiser Bill. It's Kaiser Wilhelm. And the auction was supposed to be for the benefit of the Red Cross. Manahan saw a trap. If he bought the bird, he would be pro-German. If he didn't buy the bird, he would be anti-Red Cross. So he outbid everyone and bought the parrot for $15. Then he jumped up on a table and started a new auction, challenging Nicholas, the county attorney, to prove his patriotism by bidding. In the ensuing uproar, the sheriff rearrested Gilbert. In a fit of anger, Manahan told the hostile townspeople that he would ask the farmers to boycott the town if Gilbert was not released. Farmers bailed Gilbert out a second time, and as the crowd grew more threatening, Manahan, Paddock, and Gilbert attempted a retreat. In his memoir, Manahan wrote that the mob caught him before he could reach the hotel. Someone yelled, "Get a rope!" He sheepishly recounted how he saved himself by telling the crowd that he was only a lawyer trying a case for a living, and that he had no use for those damn socialists. The crowd agreed to let him go if he would drop Gilbert's case and leave town. The next day, Gilbert was convicted and was freed pending appeal. Well, that's kind of funny. But after that, the county attorneys of these 3 counties in southern Minnesota got really serious. They started using conspiracy charges, sedition charges, and eventually Gilbert and Arthur Townley, the head of the Nonpartisan League, spent serious jail time after the armistice in county jails. Gilbert spent a whole year in jail for these things. Can I read one more?
You had a slide of that lawyer, didn't you?
Huh?
You had a slide of that guy.
Oh yes, I forgot about that. There's Mr. Manahan.
Good one.
Marshall likes that. He's got nice hair.
Our Jim's dad.
This is another guy who, somebody should be writing about this. Okay, so I'm going to read one more. And this has to do with what happened at the University of Minnesota. And, those of us of a certain age, I guess most of us, kind of grew up thinking that universities were a place where faculty and students would tend to take at least a skeptical attitude about America's adventures at war abroad, and where academic freedom would be the rule. I mean, maybe we all thought that until a couple days ago. If you're reading the news, it certainly doesn't apply at Columbia anymore, but anyway. But in World War I, it was different. It was very different. The faculties at the university and the colleges were very much all for the war. And those faculty who buck the trend, we're in trouble. And so this is a story about that. John McGee, remember John McGee, asked Fred Snyder, the chair of the Board of Regents of the University of Minnesota, to investigate several university professors infected with what he called the germ of disloyalty. McGee wrote that the Commission for Public Safety, thought the matter could be safely entrusted to the regents. The decision was not surprising, given that Snyder, who was a major political figure in Minneapolis at the time, was the Hennepin County director of the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety, and Governor Burnquist also sat on the Board of Regents ex officio. McGee attached an unsigned anonymous statement that claimed that all but one member of the German department was disloyal, and in addition, quote, there are two other rapid pro-Germans in official positions, namely William Schaefer, the head of the political science department, and Alfred Ohry, the dean of dentistry. Watch out for those dentists. Snyder consulted with Marion Burton, who had just become university president, and the stage was set for an inquisition. When summoned before the regents in late summer, most of the professors, including all the German language faculty, established their loyalty. By the way, we have a picture of Schaefer. Thank you. There he is. Thanks. So, the German language faculty all established their loyalty. On September 13th, the board interrogated the last two, Dean Aker and Schaefer. The regents concluded that Aker, a mild-mannered pacifist, was a harmless eccentric and sent him back to work. Burton then summoned Schaefer and informed him that the regents wanted to question him about his loyalty. With no idea why this was happening and no time to prepare, Schaefer was ushered into the boardroom. What happened next marks the low point in the university's history. William Schaefer was born in La Crosse, the son of German immigrants. The University of Minnesota hired him in 1901 after he had just completed his doctorate at Columbia. By 1917, he was chair of the political science department and a respected scholar. Schaefer bristled at what he felt were ridiculous insinuations and a humiliating process. He told the regents that, although he did not oppose the war effort, he could not, quote, boost for the war because he had relatives fighting on both sides. When asked what he meant by boosting, he replied that it is revolting to my conscience to go out and harangue public meetings for the purpose of arousing the war spirit. This response angered Pierce Butler, a well-known trial attorney representing railroads, etc., who grilled Schaefer as Burton, the president, sat silently. You want the Kaiser to dominate the world, don't you? He demanded. Schaefer, just as angry, responded that he thought Butler's question was utterly absurd. To men like Burton, the president, Snyder, and Pierce Butler, however, the question was anything but absurd. They had internalized McGee's 100% loyalty ideology that branded a person who was not completely loyal as a traitor. Acquiescence was not enough. Boosting was exactly what they expected of university faculty. After almost 2 hours of tense interchange, the board deliberated and then fired Schaefer by unanimous vote. The resolution terminating him said that, quote, the university, the state, and the nation require unqualified loyalty on the part of all teachers at the university, coupled with willingness and ability by precept and example to further the national purpose in the present crisis. The regents made clear that they had dismissed Schaefer solely for statements he had just made in the boardroom. That was the only evidence they had. He probably could have kept his job if he had projected a more obsequious attitude. He was, however, in no mood to cooperate. Schaefer left the university that afternoon unemployed, and he would not find another academic job for 8 years. Well, in the epilogue, Lives After Wartime, there is kind of a happy ending to that story. He eventually did find a job, and the university did eventually reverse itself. After many years of farmer labor governors, the board of the regents were different than they were in 1970. But anyway, that's another story. So I'm going to stop then, and because I've talked too long.
Oh, that's right.
And see what you guys have to say. Any questions people have?
First of all, I want to thank you for this effort on the focus. Recently, I read Adam Hochschild's book, American Midnight,
Right.
which gives you the
Yep.
federal, the national level
Yep.
under Wilson.
Yep.
So this is, built in, this focus, the local focus. McGee sounds a little bit like the Elon Musk of this era. You say he was independent, wasn't voted, nobody elected him.
No, I mean, he was reelected once as a district court judge, but that was the only time. He was not, yeah.
Okay.
No, he was just appointed, he was just completely an appointee, yeah.
Okay. I a brief exposure to the local front, as it were, in World War I, with Howard Zinn's People's History,
Mhm.
where he points out that in Minnesota, during World War I, the teaching of German language was forbidden in schools. I don't know if you get into that.
Well, okay, so I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, you know, when you think about it, and I haven't said a word about anti-German stuff in
Yeah.
this whole time. So many people, when they think about World War I, think, oh yeah, that was the time when people are hard on the Germans, which was true.
Yeah.
But I think it was less true in Minnesota than other places. So there were places where you know, the use of, like in Iowa, the governor had this proclamation saying that German couldn't be used publicly anywhere. It was bizarre. I don't know how you would enforce something like that. But no, the commission was very concerned about Germans and very concerned about how much German was being used in schools. I mean, in fact, they figured out there was a couple hundred schools in Minnesota where German was the language of instruction, Catholic parochial schools, etc. And they tried to discourage it, but they never actually banned it. So I mean, you know, when you think about it, the commission, in my view, was primarily interested in class issues, not ethnic issues. And so they didn't want to take on the whole German community, which was, of course, the largest immigrant community in Minnesota, for no particularly good reason. Now, many Germans, like, for example, William Schaefer, German Americans, you know, got themselves in trouble on the loyalty issue, and maybe they were more likely to be singled out on the loyalty issue because they were Germans. But it's kind of hard to pull those apart. And then, of course, besides what the Commission for Public Safety was doing, there's a lot of freelance anti-German stuff going on, of course, all the time too, and you know, where people, you know, worry that other people that's not going to be good for their business, for example. So, for example, the Germania Life Insurance Company in St. Paul took down its big statue of the giant statue of Germania and changed itself to was it the Guarantee Life Insurance Company? I think it became, or no, the Guardian Life Insurance Company in the middle of the war. It was just that kind of a business decision. I mean, why have this unpopular name when you didn't have to? So it's kind of complicated, but I think generally the anti-German part of the story is kind of overdone in many places. And I think what the Commission for Public Safety was primarily interested in is how can we stop the IWW, the Socialist Party, the trade unions, and the Nonpartisan League. And the fact of the matter is that many of the members of all those organizations were in fact German, and so there's a big overlap in those things. So,
Just one other thing. To me, this is another book. Where did Lindbergh Jr. go wrong?
Here's another book. And
That's right, though.
that's something I have to figure out more.
Okay.
You know, we were talking in the press about, you know, having an event up at in Little Falls at the Lindbergh House, and if I ever went up there to talk about it, then we'd have to deal with this question. What's happened at the Lindbergh House, by the way, this is one of the reasons why I want to push this idea of Lindbergh Senior, is that if you go up to the Lindbergh House in Little Falls, it's basically interpreted as the boyhood home of the son. But it was actually Lindbergh Senior's house, and Lindbergh Jr. was not there that much because Lindbergh and his wife split up, and they were separated, etc. Anyway, but the Minnesota Historical Society, in its wisdom, decided to interpret it as the home of his son for obvious reasons, which is that he's this international celebrity, right? Everybody wants to know about Lindbergh Jr.
Right.
But in fact, it was really the father's house. But the connection between them, I mean, I know it's a little tricky because they both were opposed to going to a war, but it seemed to me very different. And I guess I can't really go much further than that on that, but it's really something interesting to try to unpack. The main thing I want you to do is just make sure you separate these two guys. They're two different people. Yes,
So
Susie.
it may not be part of your story, but I'm curious about the role of organized religion in these various enterprises. Is that part of it?
You know, I don't really have much about it, but here's what I found. It was a really disappointing story to me. So I was looking around for any evidence of. So I was raised I'm not a Catholic anymore, but I was raised a Catholic during the Vietnam era, and we always talked about the just war theory, going
Sure.
back to St. Augustine or whatever. So I thought, well, people must have really debated in the churches in Minnesota the just war theory no, not at all. No, I mean, I was kind of amazed. I mean, the churches basically just got on board. And Bishop Ireland, you know, you may know, I mean, Ireland's big thing was to try to integrate Irish Minnesotans into mainstream society as quickly as possible. So the last thing he wanted to do was to take a stand against the war. Besides which, he was a Civil War veteran. That just wasn't in him. So I mean, he was all for the war, and all the mainstream. So that the churches that the business elite went to, Presbyterian, Episcopal, Congregational, they were all. So I don't know. I mean, I didn't. So what the only thing I found was that some small German Lutheran pastors got themselves in trouble for complaining about the war, just the same way as some of their parishioners did. But that would have been about it. In terms of the big religions and Catholicism and the big Protestant religions, I was really disappointed. I wasn't surprised that they supported the war, but that they didn't even think about it, debate it. So,
There you go.
yes, Paul.
You talked about economic interests clashing.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that, especially in outstate Minnesota, there was a lot of just personal hatred, wasn't there? I mean, the businessmen in town, didn't they rely on the custom of the farmers for their livelihood? And yet, there's hatred, isn't
I know.
there?
I tell you the truth, in all my research, this was the thing that actually was most surprising and amazing to me. The level of hostility right at the city line. It's just amazing. And yet, right, they seem to be economically codependent. But, I mean, some people who've written about this say, well, there's a couple things that were happening. One is that the small town business community had been generally kind of part of the progressive movement, but now they were kind of freaked out by socialism and the nonpartisan league, and they were moving in the direction of joining the big city conservative Republicans and becoming part of that part of the Republican Party, as part of the progressive part of the Republican Party. But also, they did feel economically threatened. So, for example, I know it seems kind of it's mundane, but when the nonpartisan league said we have to have state-run crop insurance, the local insurance salesmen say, "Well, what about me? I'm not going to be part of this. It could be a state-run insurance thing." Or the guy who ran the local grain elevator, the nonpartisan league says we want to have state-run grain elevators instead of having to rely on these local guys who are beholden to Pillsbury deciding, whether our wheat is of what grade it is. And so the townspeople did feel threatened that if the nonpartisan league really got its full program, they would be cut out of a lot of the action. I mean, that's one explanation, but it's, I mean, really the level of hostility. So during the campaign in June of 1918, when a nonpartisan league car caravan would drive into a town, St. Peter, Wilmer, you name it, almost for sure, townspeople will run out, rip all the Lindbergh signs off the cars, and starts fights. I mean, it was almost guaranteed. It's amazing how much hostility there was. And then when you look at the election results, in town, it would be like 90% for Burnquist, and in the adjoining township, which was primarily rural, it'd be 90% for Lindbergh. It's unbelievable when you look at those figures. Just between town and farmers, it was surprising.
And did they make up?
Nope. I don't know a lot about this. I mean, the problem is after the war, we have a big rural recession in the 20s, and things just got worse and worse for the farmers, generally speaking. So, I don't know. Yeah, it was 20s are a whole nother. Somebody needs to write a book about the 20s. Not me, but somebody should, because it was kind of a sad time. Steve.
Greg, any idea why there has been so little written about this period, given all the strands that you're talking about?
Well, first off, I don't want to overstate the case. there have been things written. So way back in 1990, a wonderful historian from Augsburg named Carol Krislock wrote a book called Watchdog of Loyalty about the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety. It's kind of an institutional history of the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety, so, what I try to do is much, much broader, so it's not like nobody did. But if you think about it, generally speaking, I think Americans don't know what to do with World War I. I mean, it doesn't have a comfortable narrative, right? I mean, if you go to Barnes and Noble, maybe probably this place too, and look at the books on the Civil War or World War II, and then look at the number of books on World War I, you'll see that people want to buy books about World War II and want to buy books about the Civil War, but there's not much interest in World War I. And I think it's because, or one idea would be, those wars have these nice storylines. World War II is the good war, and et cetera, et cetera. And World War I is like, what exactly did we win? I mean, what was it? Especially because, what Wilson thought he had won at least at the Paris Peace Conference was the League of Nations, and he came back and the Senate wouldn't approve it. And so, I mean, basically, it's like, what was this? What did we do? What happened? What did we, what did it mean? And it's foggy at best. And so I think that's part of the reason. I mean, the other thing, in terms of all this fighting going on in Minnesota during this period, when you really get into it and talking about this violence between farmers and whatever, this is not the Minnesota nice that you may have grown up thinking. I mean, Minnesota was not nice, and I don't know how you can even think of Minnesota as being nice after thinking about this kind of stuff for a while. So anyway, it doesn't fit into the kind of one of the narratives we have about thinking about ourselves, or at least some of us have, or used to have, about Minnesota being such a nice, well-governed, civil place. It's like, whoa, not then. Yeah. Yes, Larry.
Greg, you might want to throw this question out. I wouldn't blame you. It could be a swamp. But in your own mind, are you ping-ponging back and forth similarities between today, like the attack on Columbia University?
Yeah, I mentioned that, yeah.
And this period, both in Minnesota and nationally?
Well, I mean, obviously there's a lot of things. I mean, one is this whole kind of anti-immigrant politics is a very big part of what was going on then. I mean, when you back in 1917 or now, when somebody says everything would be perfect in America if we just deported 4 million people, I mean, I think it's kind of a warning that something's not quite right. And also, I mean, I think this period also helps you understand that when you do see people making that anti-immigrant politics a primary thing, sometimes it's a cover for obscuring economic conflicts below the surface. So that'd be one thing. The second thing would be, and people are talking about this all the time now, but the fragility of democratic institutions. I mean, essentially, the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety was kind of like a coup. I mean, they took over, and that's kind of what it was. And then they kept pushing and pushing and pushing. John McGee kept pushing to where, by 1918, there was kind of de facto martial law that had never been declared, in terms of what was going on in Minnesota. All kind of justified by the fact that we were at war with Germany 4,000 or 5,000 miles away. So that's another thing. A positive thing, here's a positive thing, because I'm trying to find some positive things. Good idea, okay? Is the way the Twin Cities Labor Movement and the Nonpartisan League decided to support each other's demands and not just support their own demands as a way of building an alliance. And that was very interesting to me. And it's really hard to do. And they were kind of pushed together by John McGee in a way, by John McGee coming down hard on both of them, kind of pushed them together as allies. But when you start having whole groups of people taking seriously the needs and interests of other different from themselves in society and building a coalition, then you got something. And that would be another takeaway. You can somehow make that happen more now than it is. It'd be really good. Rick?
Okay, without asking you to do a spoiler alert, what happened to the commission?
What happened to the commission? Well, the good thing about the commission was they kind of acknowledged that after the armistice, that they should be kind of out of business. And that was a little bit ambiguous. They said that the law said they would serve for the duration of the war, and the armistice didn't exactly end the war. It was an armistice. It wasn't a peace treaty. But they all kind of agreed that the war could not possibly start again, and so they would end. However, the conservatives tried to see if they could hang on to some of the things they had gained, like the motor corps and the home guard, et cetera, and they tried to institutionalize them. And there was kind of an uproar, and the labor movement really fought back, because the labor movement realized that the motor corps and the home guard only had one purpose, and that was to stop them. So they managed to get the legislature to not institutionalize those things. So maybe that'd be one part of it. So the Commission for Public Safety did stop, and Governor Burnquist was asked not to run again by the Republican Party for governor, because he was so tainted by his association with John McGee. The labor movement coined this term McGeeism to stand for all the terrible things that had happened during World War I to the labor movement, and they said Burnquist stands for McGeeism, and so therefore he was very unpopular, and he didn't run again for governor. So there's a lot of fallout, and yeah. Anyway, so we had enough? Jerry?
Given the fact that there was this disturbance in Russia around this time, I'm curious whether there were any partisan league people who were overtly favorable toward the revolution, and what, if they were, what happened to them during this period in Minnesota?
Yeah, I think there was a couple of things. One is a lot of people, not even on the far left, were interested and curious about what was happening in Russia, and to be fair to everybody, it was really hard for anybody to know what was really happening in Russia. So a lot of things were said favorably, about what was happening there that were just weren't really based on much. But yeah, I think that people on the left generally were really interested in what was happening with the Bolshevik Revolution, and whether it would survive, and whether it would really lead to some really interesting, new, important thing. You have to realize, we're kind of used to it now, but when the Bolsheviks seized power and said they were starting the socialist revolution in 1917, it was like earth-shattering. We used to use the term world historic, right? It was like a big deal, and for everybody, whether you liked it or didn't like it, and no one had any idea, whether it survived, what would happen, whether it would be good or bad. It was kind of wide open. What I did notice, though, is that even before the Bolsheviks seized power, conservatives in Minnesota were already using the word Bolshevik, or they used to say Bolsheviki, which is the plural version, but they didn't know that, as a kind of red baiting anybody in the labor movement, or Lindbergh or anybody. Everybody was always a Bolsheviki. And this is even before the Bolsheviks took power, because people already recognized that Lenin's party was kind of on the far left of what was going on there, and so it became an all-purpose epithet. And I was kind of surprised, because I thought all this red baiting started in the 1950s, but this was in 1917 they're throwing these things around at people. But anyway, it's kind of a hard question, because things were so fluid, and people's news of what was going on was so poor. Anyway, one more. Yes, Bob.
Follow up to Jerry's question. In light of your mention of there's 700 newspapers throughout the state, and your extensive research in some papers, what about the Bolshevik question? Did local papers carry much news about what was happening in Russia?
So yeah, one thing I noticed. So there was two revolutions in Russia. The first one was in February 19, where the Tsar was overthrown, and what I did notice in the papers then was that there was this incredible optimism that because the Tsar was overthrown and because the provisional government, which was supposedly set up this liberal government, had taken power, that this was just great. This was perfect. Everyone's problems were solved. It basically solved Woodrow Wilson's problem, because Wilson's talking about maybe entering the war on the Allies side, but the Allies included the Russian autocracy. So here he is saying, we're gonna have to fight this war for democracy with the Russian Tsar? I mean, that was completely insane. And so when the Russian Tsar fell, this was terrific for Wilson and the kind of liberal interventionists around him. And so what they tended to do was just to like have this incredible optimism about how Russia was now going to fight like crazy because liberals were in control, it was going to become a parliamentary democracy. What they didn't ask is anybody in the Russian army whether they were still interested in doing that, which nobody was, and it was a disaster. So then they forced Kerensky into having this new offensive, and the Russian army just came apart completely, and that was the end, on the eastern front. So there was this just insane optimism that the fall of the Tsar was like solved all the problems. Utopia. It did solve a political problem for Wilson. You no longer had to be chained to the Tsar in your quest for democracy, which was kind of hopeless. Anyway, should we stop?
Yeah.
Thank you. Now I'm supposed to go out to this table just in case anyone might want me to sign something. Yeah.
Yes, the author's table.
The author's table. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Way better than I expected. I'm looking forward to reading the book now. Hey, how are you?